Hello there, and welcome to our special coverage about the Russia-Ukraine file with me, Karim Fazakri, coming to you live from Algiers on All 24 News. Here's what's on tap today. The first 100 days of the Russian leaders' war against Ukraine have largely been defined by underachievement by Moscow, and Kiev exceeding all expectations. Russia very quickly failed to overthrow the government in the Ukrainian capital, has suffered colossal military losses, and has now become more isolated than since the Cold War. The war is currently focused on Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, as Putin is looking for military victory by attempting to seize the two big eastern regions, Luhansk and Donetsk, that is, swathes of which have been under the control of Kremlin-backed separatists since 2014. So, Russian President Vladimir Putin shows no sign of interest in resuming negotiations with Ukraine to end the largest conflict in Europe since World War II. There is no mystery as to why his mistake-prone military has suffered shocking setbacks and losses, but he still figures he has more to gain on the battlefield than the negotiating table. All this is going to be analyzed today in our special coverage by our panel of guests. I'm joined live via Skype by Eugene Chusovsky, a senior analyst and program head at New Lines Institute from Texas, USA, along with Dennis Speed, a founding member of Schiller Institute from New Jersey, USA. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. A break, and we start the discussion. All right, let's start with the latest on the ground. Today marks the first 100 days of conflict in Ukraine, while the situation around the capital seems to be calmer. Frightening shelling in the Donbas still takes place. Ukraine's president says 20% of his country is under Russian control, but vows to continue defending Ukraine, while Russia says it will continue its military operation in Ukraine until all its goals have been achieved.
About 20% of our territory is under the control of the occupiers, nearly 125,000 kilometers square. This is much more than the territory of all the Benelux countries. Nearly 12 million Ukrainians became internally displaced. More than 5 million, mostly women and children, moved abroad.
So let's commence with you, Mr. Eugene Chusovsky. Russia controlled 20% of Ukraine in only 100 days, despite all Western aids, diplomatically, politically, economically, and even militarily. In your opinion, this record is a win or a fail to Russian military operation?
I don't know why. I can't.
Hello there?
I think it's a bit of both of a failure and a victory. Certainly Russia has not been able to achieve the military goals that it set out at the very beginning of the conflict in terms of a fast and sweeping victory over the entire Ukrainian territory. But as you mentioned, they have made some territorial gains in parts of eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine. So I think that Russia has been able to achieve the initial goals of, or at least is working towards achieving the initial goals of taking all of the Donbas region. But in terms of the complete demilitarization or the denazification, according to Moscow, I think these goals were not really realistic in the first place, and certainly Russia, I don't think, will be achieving them in this broader conflict.
And what about the concern of Russia about Ukraine joining NATO? Isn't that a legitimate excuse, let's say?
Well, that's, based on who you ask, I suppose. From Moscow's perspective, that is a serious security concern. But if you ask the Ukrainians and NATO countries themselves, they speak to the right of self-determination, right? So I think Ukraine's entry into NATO was not a realistic prospect anytime soon. I think the real concern from Russia was the level of integration and military support from NATO for Ukraine, particularly the US, in terms of weaponry and things of that nature. But as we've seen in the conflict now in its 100th day, that support has only increased, for Ukraine, and Russia has only been further isolated as a result of its actions, at least from the West, as the West is concerned. So I think certainly very mixed results for Russia, despite its territorial gains in certain parts of the country.
Mr. Dennis Speed, do we expect a third phase of Russian military operation here, which is mainly focused now on eastern Ukraine, Donbass, or will Russia just stop its military operation in this current second phase only? I mean, would the U.S. Latest decision to supply Ukraine with additional aids help Ukraine to return back to its besieged territories?
I think there's a real problem that we have to see here in terms of what is actually developing, because the United States now has its cybersecurity forces, at least they admit, Paul Nakasone, who's the head of U.S. Cyber Command, has just made a statement to Sky News saying, we've conducted a series of operations across the full spectrum. Directly saying that the United States has been involved with cyber attacks on Russia, in effect, right, through Ukraine. So while it's true that the military objectives of the Russians are being accomplished, I think the real concern is what is the United States thinking in terms of the escalation? We've also seen many other elements of this.
De-escalation, you say. All we see here is escalation, indeed, because we see that term, or let's say strong term and strong language between the two parties are being exchanged, especially that the U.S. has sent these advanced military systems to Russia. What do you think the response from the Russian side will be, Mr. Dennis?
I think there's no way of avoiding the idea. This has been said by people like Edward Lazansky, a couple of other people who are watching this situation very carefully, that the Russians have to, and they've already said, they don't trust the Ukrainians to, in fact, abide by whatever agreement that America says they made with Ukraine. They assume and have to assume, based on what has happened in every negotiation up to now, that Ukraine is going to again reverse itself, and therefore these weapons will be used. Therefore, Russia has to now calculate this American involvement in its military calculation. And therefore, Noam Chomsky and some other people have been talking recently about the fact that, whether it's Noam Chomsky, matter of fact, or Henry Kissinger, you have to have an arresting of this process before it goes over the edge.
All right, very nice indeed. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin praised NATO leadership as he received the Alliance Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at the Pentagon. Jens Stoltenberg affirmed that NATO must prevent the Russian special operation in Ukraine from turning into an open war between Russia and NATO. Mr. Dennis, how do you think NATO will prevent an open war with Russia? Do you think that it will refuse Ukraine's demands to join their alliance and stop the war?
Well, let me say three different things here about what's going on. On the one hand, NATO is involved in a no-win circumstance. You can see what's happening on the domestic front, whether it's in Germany, Italy, France, for that matter in the United States, that the economies of the NATO countries cannot absorb the very sanctions policy that they initiated. So there's a lot of problems of social unrest that are now being talked about by people like the German finance minister, Habeck. There's other kinds of people in Italy and so on describing this. What the issue is, that's the first problem. The second problem is NATO cannot avoid it being recognized that this is now a war of aggression, very clearly against not only Russia, but also China. And this is something that, of course, people know from the Biden trip recently to the Pacific. The third problem is that Russia has to deal with this as an existential question. The fact that various people in the State Department don't understand what that means, and that those people in the State Department don't understand the issue of the fighting of war and how war fighting is seen from the Russian standpoint means. You've got an absolutely volatile mixture here, and it's anybody's guess, frankly, what's about to happen.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Eugene Chazovsky, target behind this military operation was to stop the NATO expansion eastward Europe, but now Sweden and Finland have applied to join this alliance. Could we say Russia has failed to reach the ultimate goal, which is preventing NATO to be enlarged precisely near the Russian borders?
Well, I certainly think there's a strong case for that to be made. Certainly, Russia was most concerned about NATO's eastward expansion to former Soviet states, especially Ukraine, but also Georgia and Moldova, which we've seen, Russia engage in some level of activity in each of these countries. But certainly, I think you can see the expansion, or at least the membership to apply to NATO from Finland and Sweden, as a setback for Russia and what they were looking to avoid. But it's Russia's launching of the invasion of Ukraine that sparked that expansion in the first place, because prior to the conflict, public opinion in these countries was actually strongly opposed to NATO membership and for non-aligned status. But now that they've seen that, how Russia has gone into Ukraine, and I think it is still in the interest of both Russia and NATO to avoid direct confrontation, and they will take steps to avoid that, although you can't rule it out completely. But certainly, yes, this can be seen as a negative side effect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine from Moscow's standpoint.
And how do you think Russia is leading its propaganda inside its own country? I mean, to get the support of its own people, because we see here there is a war of information, and we see that the West is gaining in this war of information. But then what's being, let's say, marketed inside Russia is something else, and people are actually backing up Vladimir Putin.
Well, to a certain extent, there is, public support, I think, within Russia, but you have to factor in, a number of things. First of all, it's a wartime scenario, so typically, not only in Russia, but in many countries, that kind of galvanizes support behind the government. But also, I think Russia has made it very costly to speak out against the war. And we've seen that, whether that was demonstrations initially when the conflict just happened, and we've seen, people speak out, whether that's former diplomats or even some current government members. And Russia has made it very clear that there's significant consequences for that. So the extent of the public support for the war, I think it's difficult to know that exactly. I don't think it's as high as the Kremlin makes it out to be. But, what Russia is framing this as is a special military operation to free Donbass, essentially the eastern part of Ukraine, and not a full-scale invasion or full-scale conflict with Ukraine. So, as you said, this is an information war going on, and I think we see both sides obviously have their different narratives.
Very nice indeed. And can you tell us about the stance of American people inside the U.S.? I mean, are they in support of Ukraine? I mean, especially seeing that the costly aid that U.S. is providing for Ukraine, militarily wise, meaning sending weapons and even financial aid. And we see that the U.S. is facing its own domestic problems.
That's true. I think overwhelmingly the support within the U.S. is for Ukraine, against the Russian invasion. And despite the costs that have come, whether that's rising gas prices, inflation more generally, or the direct financial support and military support that the U.S. is providing, I think that is largely being seen as necessary in order to have solidarity with Ukraine. And I would extend that not only in the U.S., but for the vast majority of European countries and EU and NATO members. So while there certainly have been costs, obviously most directly for the Ukrainian people for the conflict, I think these costs are willing to be borne by the people for the most part within the US and in Europe.
Very nice indeed. Moving on, the White House on Thursday announced a bevy of new sanctions on Russia as the brutal invasion of Ukraine stretches into its fourth month. The Treasury and State Departments announced a number of new measures, including targeting Russian government officials, oligarchs, and elite close to Vladimir Putin, according to a release from the White House. Back to you, Mr. Dennis Speed. Western countries have introduced increasingly widespread sanctions targeting wealthy individuals, banks, businesses, and state-owned enterprises. The world is seeking to put pressure on Russia by imposing further sanctions each time. Do you think that the latest decision by the US will harm the Russian economy indeed to an extent that it would stop its military operation? Since that is all what the world is doing, sanctioning Russia, don't you think that they are hopeful that their measures will put an end to the war?
I think the sanctions policy has been a complete disaster for the West. I don't think it's been a disaster for Russia at all. Matter of fact, the ruble is stronger now than it was at the beginning of the conflict. No, in fact, I disagree. And matter of fact, I think what has happened is that in the transatlantic countries, that the support for the war has in fact crumbled. Now, you won't see that reflected in media, just in the same way that often the media in the United States have completely ignored the sentiments of the population. But if you talk about people who are now paying $7 a gallon for gas, whether they connect that to somehow supporting the great people of Ukraine, they do not. That's not true. Of course, in polls, you're going to get all sorts of things said in the United States right now. But the truth of the matter is that the sanction policy not only has failed, the sanctions policy is being used to introduce a number of other policies, for example, the so-called reset policies that, in fact, are also not working. So I don't see that at all. In fact, I would put it this way. If, in fact, there is not a resolution of this conflict, you're going to begin to see a form of social unrest in the Western countries, which is completely unpredicted by the various elites in those countries. They're not going to be able to do that. And in fact, besides the actual danger of the war escalating to a nuclear conflict, the destruction of economy that you're getting in the Western nations cannot be sustained.
Very nice indeed. And it seems all logical, since we see that the United States has already a lot on its plate dealing with the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And we see now new measures and new policies regarding China and its expansion within the eastern part countries. So what can you tell us about this? Can actually the United States do the role of the police officer of the world and protect democracies against the authoritarian regimes as it is portrayed?
The American people have just watched the United States assemble an amount of money equivalent to the entire Russian defense budget and instantaneously, quote unquote, committed. At the same time, as you have a situation where you don't have baby formula in the United States, you have 40% increase in the price of butter in Germany, you have this massive destruction of the actual physical economy. There is a way out, but the way out would be to completely reverse course and engage Russia and China in a whole other set of initiatives which could be taken on. And that is the kind of thing that people from Schiller Institute and other organizations have talked about. But whether that will happen, that's another issue. We need a new security and development architecture. We need an approach which is different than the failed approach. I will tell you this. There is no way this present deployment by the United States will sustain without a major social explosion, either in the United States or other parts of the transatlantic world.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Chosovsky, Eugene Chosovsky, keeping up this pressure on President Vladimir Putin's regime is justified. However, don't you think that it's no game changer? I mean, couldn't the West think of more reasonable resolutions, as our distinguished guest, Mr. Dennis Speed, just said? For example, not include Ukraine in NATO alliance. What do you think are the best resolution to end this war?
Well, I certainly think there should be a mixture of both pressure and engagement with Russia, because I don't think going one way or the other is going to be very effective. So in terms of the sanctions pressure, that has, weakened Russia's economy. It's true that the ruble is at a higher value than it was at the start of the conflict, but I think a lot of the sanctions pressure is only going to be felt more and more as the war drags on within Russia, especially when you're factoring in things like technology, export controls, and things of that nature. But I think the U.S. and the West should engage with Russia, but we should also consider that giving major concessions without asking for anything in return can be a form of appeasement. And certainly Ukraine and other countries on the eastern periphery, including Sweden and Finland, are certainly not exactly eager to make major concessions, because they don't know that if they give territorial concessions or even security guarantees, things like NATO membership, what's to stop Russia from moving further down the line. So I do think it's a mixture of pressure and engagement. And ultimately, I think, unfortunately, Russia will not be serious about diplomacy until it's achieved at least some of its objectives on the battlefield. So I think if and when Russia is able to take over all of Donbass, right now they're making some steady gains, but still facing some resistance. I don't think they're going to be very serious about negotiations until there's a new reality on the ground. from which then they may be more willing to negotiate.
So are you saying that peace here means Ukraine has to lose more of its territory? Is that what you're saying?
I think Russian officials have made it very clear that they have certain objectives that they are going to fulfill no matter the cost, whether that's the military cost that we've seen or the economic cost that Russia has endured as a result of its actions. So I think we've seen even measures to hold referendums in certain parts of Ukrainian territory, whether that's in the Donbass or in Kherson Oblast, in order for these territories to be part of Russia, similar to what we saw in Crimea back in 2014. So I think with those goals and those indicators in mind, it's hard to see Russia really serious about negotiations. Once that has been settled, if and when that has been settled, because certainly Ukraine and the West are trying to prevent that from happening, then perhaps Russia will be more serious about negotiations. But all indicators point to them trying to reshape things on the ground first and then get into the diplomacy.
And here, Mr. Eugene, let me ask you this question. Do you agree with Mr. Dennis Speed when he said that these sanctions were disastrous even for the West? I mean, the sanctions backfired against the West.
Certainly, there has been a cost to the sanctions that we're all feeling, whether that's energy prices, food prices. In that sense, it has been very painful. Whether it's a disaster or not, that depends on your threshold for pain. And I think, within the U.S., probably politically, that will be felt in the midterms. Other European countries could feel it. But I think the potential for major chaos, Russia is feeling it a lot more. And so this is why I'm saying I think sanctions are important, but they can't be the only tool in the toolkit. It would be more useful to engage in a more constructive form of diplomacy. But actors like Russia, rarely respond to that kind of constructive engagement alone. So to me, it's a mixture of those things, and it's really trying to balance, these punitive measures with more constructive elements.
And to talk more about the repercussions or economic repercussions, here we share this info. Oil rose more than 1% after U.S. crude inventories fell more than expected amid high demand for fuel. Shrugging off OPEC Plus's agreement to boost crude output to compensate for a drop in Russian production, prices were also supported by the European Union's sixth package of sanctions against Russia, which will include an immediate ban on new insurance contracts for ships carrying Russian oil and a 6-month phase-out on existing contracts. Back to you, Mr. Dennis Speed. Oil producer group OPEC Plus agreed to rubber stamp another small production increase for June amid persistent concerns over weaker Chinese demand and shortly after the world's largest trading bloc outlined proposals for new sanctions against Russian crude. Do you think that OPEC Plus nations are capable of pumping more oil, which could replace Russian oil supplies? Knowing that oil markets ignored the decision, statistics showed no change since yesterday. How do you explain the ignorance or this ignorance despite the acceleration of OPEC Plus alliance to increase oil production?
I think there are three things to again, be very clear about there. What you're looking at there is a change in the speculation around oil, number one. Number two, there's a question about whether you can replace the Russian production. I think the answer to that is no. And I think that that's going to be very clearly felt. Now, there's another matter altogether, which is, are you changing using the occasion of what you're calling the conflict? And by the way, let me simply say that conflict began in 2014, began with a coup that occurred, which was run by the United States. We all know Victoria Nuland and her Cookie Monster routine in the Donbass, giving out cookies to the demonstrators and putting $5 billion into that. So we know that the conflict actually originates from the Russian standpoint and in reality from 8 years earlier, and that there was also a military conflict. So the energy side of this and what is happening around this really has to be looked at from the standpoint of whether there's another kind of change being introduced. Now, that's the change around what some people call Great Reset. Many other terms are given for it. I think that with respect to Russia itself, that this is not having a decisive effect on Russia. First of all, because of the deals with China that had already been in existence before that, and the fact that many other nations around the world do not support what is going on with sanctions. Now, the implications in terms of oil, et cetera, are a little different. But I just would point out that if you simply take a good look at the physical effects of this crisis on the transatlantic world, look at what has happened with respect to Hungary's dispute, for example, with the rest of NATO on this, and the fact that other nations are trying to do various kinds of deals, the fact that several nations are paying in rubles, as the Russians asked them to do. So this is, this is a different animal. The real problem would be the miscalculation leading to thermonuclear war. And that is the thing that Kissinger is concerned about and Noam Chomsky are concerned about. They're completely politically opposite. But yet they say the same thing. There should be a neutral Ukraine. There should be negotiations immediately. And they don't see that as a question of appeasement. They see that as a question of rational discourse, which should have happened before the war started.
And why aren't we going toward this direction anyways? What's it for Russia or for the U.S. to drag this war on? Mr. Eugene.
Well, you have a few people that think that the idea of imperialism has not died, that you can have large-scale conflicts on the European continent or any other continent, up to and including the possible use of thermonuclear weapons. The fact is that era is over. Anybody that is trying to deal with the world that way is going to find that they can't do it. And I think, frankly, that the Russia-China Memorandum of Understanding of February 4th, which talked about the idea of a certain kind of alliance independent of a unipolar world approach. This is something that the United States, London in particular, the city of London, the financial centers, Wall Street and London, have to realize they are not going to dominate the world any longer, and it's time to, get real. We can have a different economic and development architecture and a new security architecture. Now, some people are going to not like that, but that's just the way things are.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Eugene Chazovsky, how do you see a way out, briefly, before we wrap up our debate? Eugene Chazovsky, I mean, the world is facing food prices skyrocketing since the Russian military operation in Ukraine, and Turkey here seeks role in solving food crisis along with the UN. Do you think that Turkey will make a progress during the upcoming meeting with Russia? And are we going to see any diplomatic efforts to end this war completely?
Well, I think we've seen Turkey's efforts at mediation, broader mediation between Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, it has not been successful. Perhaps they can be more effective in a more specific issue like the grain exports, which are, hurting not only Ukraine and Russia, but also the wider world. But ultimately, I think, where we'll start to see progress is when the military aspect of the conflict and Russia's launching of the invasion is wrapped up. And so, as I mentioned before, I don't think Russia has indicated that it's not really serious about negotiations until it accomplishes its goals on the ground. Perhaps we can then get into more serious diplomacy. But then, of course, you have Ukraine and its Western backers that are trying to prevent Russia from achieving those goals. But ultimately, everything that we've been talking about, whether that's energy prices, grain, things of that nature, everybody is essentially losing from this. So it would be great to get to a point where, they can really talk about the fundamental aspects of security. So whether that's, Ukraine's neutrality, although that will have to be backed up with some security guarantees to prevent Russia from taking further action. But ultimately, I think everybody is entitled to their basic security needs. But, you can't just meet those needs at the expense of somebody else, like Russia is doing in Ukraine. So once that mindset shifts, or once the battlefield becomes exhausted, essentially, hopefully the former, not the latter, that's when I think we can start to see a way out, or at least an evolution of the current conflict.
But Mr. Eugene here, talking just about the food crisis deal here, we see there are many hurdles to any deal anyhow, including Russian demands for some sanctions to be lifted in return. The drifting mines, the prohibitive costs of ensuring the maritime route. Officials and analysts are saying that. Do you think that Russia will ask for a lifting for sanctions in order to make it reach a deal with Ukraine? And could naval convoys lift the blockade on Ukraine grain here?
Well, clearly that's what Russia is trying to do, is essentially using the grain blockade as a source of leverage in order to get Western sanctions lifted. I don't think that's going to be successful, at least not in the short term. But what this shows is how interconnected everything is as a result of the conflict because of how the global economy operates. So, Russia certainly has its tools at its advantage, just like the West does in terms of sanctions and military support. It will ultimately come down to when they're really serious about making a deal and then, alleviating this pain that not only both sides have felt, but also the global economy has felt. And hopefully that happens sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much. Thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. We have reached the end of our program. That's the end for now. Bye-bye.